This week we are talking about character and ethics in leadership. And I think it's important to ask the question, why? Why are we talking about character? We obviously recognize that there are a lot of leaders around us who lead and seem to lead well, and many of them don't have clear character. We live in an age of image where what you see is often more valued than what's actually there, what's behind the curtain, so to speak. And if you look at the evidence, I think no, character isn't important. Look at the popularity of leaders who have clear weaknesses in character. There are probably a number of current examples that you could think of. Leaders caught in immoral or unethical situations, leaders who are espousing values that clearly don't line up with someone who has character and cares about things beyond just image and power and gaining control. I'll avoid making comments about particular political leaders and their lack of character, but I think you're all aware of people who are lacking in substance and yet have an abundance of followers. The truth is that character and integrity are non-essentials of leadership. You can lead without character. People follow you even if you have no character or integrity. All you need for people to follow you really is charisma, charm, some sort of inspiring vision, and really, in a word, image. Andy Stanley is one of my favorite authors in the area of character and leadership, and he, in his book The Next Generation Leader, says that you can lead without character, but character is what makes you a leader worth following. Integrity is not important if your aspirations as a leader end with simply persuading people to follow you. And I think this is important to understand, and I think it's important to ask yourself what your end goal of leadership or influence is. And let me stress that you do and you will influence people even if you never hold an official leadership position. So don't assume that this isn't for you just because you're not currently leading or you don't anticipate leading in the future. I never anticipated holding some of the management or leadership positions I've held. So the truth is that character, when we talk about it in terms of leadership, is really for everyone. I would hope to think that character is for everyone, but we're going to limit our discussion here to leaders. So why talk about character? Does character matter to you? If it's not necessary for leadership or influence to take place, why are we talking about it? And I think you need to figure this out. It can't be important because some professors said it was important or because your parents or pastors say so. It has to be important for your own reasons. And when it gets challenged, and it will, you need to have some strength of resolve that arises out of something internal to you and not something imposed on you by someone else. If you're a Christian, you're a believer, and you have the Holy Spirit as a strong component of that internal motivation, but I think identifying your own values are also important because this allows you to find a personally compelling reason for doing what is often the more difficult thing to do. When I think about character, this Latin phrase, esse quam videri, or videri, I'm not really sure how it's pronounced. So esse quam videri is kind of something that comes to mind, and it means to be rather than to see. And this line originates with the Roman thinker Cicero, and is actually randomly the state motto of North Carolina, which probably isn't important, but a little bit of trivia for you. Anyway, his point was that most people want to appear virtuous rather than actually be virtuous. And that's probably true. It's easier to look like someone of character than it is to actually be someone of character. To be rather than to seem to be means that we do the hard work of developing character, integrity, moral strength, and certitude, virtues, and we allow for self-sacrifice that comes with the development of the fruits of the Spirit of God within us in His process of sanctification. And we do all this, and it's difficult, but we do that rather than just creating some sort of image that appears to be, that seems to be of character. So defining character. The Hebrew understanding and the Greek understanding, if we look back in Scripture, the Hebrew understanding is really about righteousness. It's the heart of a person, the virtues they possess. We see this in Proverbs when the writer talks about the wise versus the foolish. He isn't talking about someone who is smart and someone who wasn't smart. He's not talking about intelligence. It was an acceptance of God's way of living, which would lead to a disciplined life resulting in good that would benefit the community. We see this in many of the Proverbs. He says, "For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He guards the path of the justice, so that the path of justice, and the watching the way over the saints, so that benefits the community." He says that if you pursue righteousness and justice, then wisdom will come into your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant for your soul. Discretion will watch over you, understanding will guard you, or basically you'll know what to do in difficult situations. But those who forsake the path of righteousness, will walk in the ways of darkness. And darkness there could mean sin. It could also mean just a lack of understanding. The Greek understanding, so New Testament, character was to scratch or engrave. It was a mark, kind of like a stamp on a coin. Character traits were considered part of a person and mostly unchangeable. So if you think about Greek literature and the plays, maybe some that you read in high school or even college, the gods gave certain traits which to certain people, and there were certain character flaws. So in Greek literature, the tragedy was based on some sort of inherent flaw in the character of that person that would eventually be, their undoing. So Oedipus and Oedipus Rex, it was sort of this flaw. It was fated that he was eventually going to kill his father and marry his mom, and that was kind of their idea. Like, you couldn't do anything about it. And these ways of thinking have come down to us in our Western culture, and they've been part of our way of thinking for hundreds of years. That character is something that's deeply, deeply ingrained in us. That it's a moral thing, and that it's something that needs to be guarded over. Until recently, that is. There's one more line there. So Greeks saw it as the essence of the person, and both of them have this idea of what's internal to the person. So this was pretty much just the way that people thought, really for hundreds, thousands of years. Then in the 1920s is the idea when the idea of image came into sort of cultural consciousness. And if you look at the books and literature on developing yourself as a person throughout history, sort of the self-help books of history, and leading up to the early 20th century, the focus was nearly exclusively on the development of character, morality, integrity, even from non-religious people who had no sort of faith affiliation. It was just assumed that the internal person, their virtues, their credibility, were far more important than any exterior traits. Then the book How to Win Friends and Influence Enemies by Dale Carnegie was published in the early 1900s. And this completely replaced the idea of being a moral person, and it really marks the turning point in public thought on what a good person was. After this point, more books were published about how to hone your image than about how to shape your character. And so we can sort of see in that public perception of what makes a good person has changed from what was internal to someone to what's external of someone. So let's talk about our definition of character. I've sort of been skirting around a definition, just kind of saying it's important, but let's actually define it. I think character is the outward expression of the inner reality of a person. I think it's a fundamentally moral description. I think we see that in the Bible, that what is going on inside someone is far more important than what's going on outside of someone. If you're familiar with the Old Testament Bible stories, you might remember when the boy David was chosen as the future king of Israel. He didn't visually have much to offer. He's young. His brothers were more physically impressive. He had no experience. He pretty much had a servant-level job in the household. But God reminded his people that he looked on the inside, while humans tend to look at what's offered externally. And that's obviously pretty limited to only see what's on the outside. I realize that that means that we're trying to figure out what's inside a person and not just what's outside a person. And we might feel uncomfortable with the idea of evaluating another person's inward state, but the Bible is pretty quick to categorize people into wise versus fools, righteous versus unrighteous, faithful versus unfaithful. Jesus used the analogy of sheep versus goats. So speaking from a biblical worldview, evaluating someone's outward expression of their inner reality isn't unfairly judging, it's being discerning. If your outward expression is different from the inner reality, people would refer to you as a hypocrite, which is generally synonymous with bad character. And if your inner reality is good, but you don't follow through, you're usually considered irresponsible. So, like I said, it's essentially a moral description You're describing something that's generally positive or negative. I know a lot of people sort of want to describe it as personality or style of life, but it's something that it's beyond that. Some people want to say it's beyond someone's control and not a moral element, but I think we do have control over it. Character is good or it's bad. It isn't that you don't have it or you do have it. We all have character. We all have some sort of internal essence or reality. From a Hebrew understanding, where we either have a good heart or bad heart, or either wise or we're fools. Character doesn't change overnight. It's built over many years, and by the time a person reaches their highest leadership positions, it might as well be set in stone, though, nothing's impossible with God. And I think it's formed from both the inside as well as the outside in. And the longer you wait, I think, to work on your character, the more difficult that's going to be. As much as I'm focusing here on the personal responsibility of a person, I would be wrong to say that a person's character is shaped entirely by his or herself. There's a number of factors that influence or shape our character. I'm going to talk about those a little bit later. So all of that to say, character is changeable if a person is willing to change their character, but it's not easy to change character. So the outward expression of the inner reality of a person. So what are some of those outward expressions? And let me just get those all up there now. If character is the outward expression of the inner reality, what do I mean by outward expressions? And there are several things I mean by that. First of all, behavior. Christ said that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. I also think out of the abundance of the heart or the inner person, the body acts. Conscious or unconscious, your behavior is a result of what's going on inside of you. So are you aware of what's going on inside of you? I think that's an important question to ask inside your mind, inside your heart. I think there are reactions. Those spontaneous or unconscious actions and choices you make are maybe not all that spontaneous. They're the results of years and years of internal working, choices, decisions, the truth and lies that you believe about yourself, secret idols. You might respond to a situation without thinking and then try to justify that action by, saying I didn't even think, I just acted. But that reaction was formed a long time ago based on what's been going on in your inner person. Reactions come from the most easily worn paths, as do habits. So habits are those things that you regularly do without even thinking much about them. Good things like brushing your teeth and combing your hair. Bad things like picking your nose. All of those things are habits. And habits are hard to break because the neural pathways in your brain have been strengthened after repeated use. And I think this is kind of there's some fascinating research in this, but neural pathways are kind of like, in your brain, you've got a lot of neurons, the brain cells, and they connect with one another. And those connections are sort of considered to be these neural pathways. And they act like interstate highways, and they carry neural impulses that pretty thoughtlessly direct muscles so that you fiddle with your hair without thinking about it, or you kind of fidget when you're not thinking about it. Sometimes they bring up thoughts and ideas that when you find your mind wandering, when you're bored, those things that are reoccurring are pretty much reoccurring because after repeatedly sort of being pulled up out of your mental file, it's easy for your brain to go there. So that's why doing new things is hard. So neurologically speaking, you've got these interstate 8-lane highways, and it's really easy for information communication between those cells to travel up and down these highways, right? You're flying down a interstate highway 80 miles an hour, carrying your load of information from one neuron cell to the next neural cell, and that's really easy for that to happen. But when you don't have those strong connections, it's kind of like a little overgrown footpath in the jungle, and you have to sort of hack your way through it, and it's not easy. And so that's why doing new things or learning new things is really difficult, because you don't have the same neural connections that you have with something that comes really easily to you. However, if you continue down that footpath, you take a machete, you hack away at some of the branches, it gets a little bit wider, you pack down the dirt, you pack down the earth, pretty soon it's wide enough, you can ride a bike or maybe take a horse and then a horse with a cart and maybe then a car, and soon it's a dirt road, and you can move pretty fast down that dirt road, and then eventually it becomes wider and it's like a paved road. So that's sort of an analogy that kind of helps us understand the way new neural connections are formed. It's obviously difficult. However, the opposite principle is also at work. If you've got an 8-lane highway where you've got maybe a habit or reaction that you don't like, if you leave that highway alone, if you don't travel up and down it, if you don't, have maintenance on it, you don't take care of it, eventually, sooner or later, there's going to be some cracks, and weeds are going to start to grow up in the cracks, and then little seeds will get in there and grow big trees, and the roots are going to break up the asphalt, and soon there's more grass and vines, and after a while, you need a machete to get through where you used to be able to drive an 18-wheeler truck. Okay, it's a weird picture, but I hope it makes sense. But I'm making an analogy of what's happening in our brains with our neural circuitry. All that to say, none of this happens by accident. You won't develop new ways of thinking, new habits, new reactions by accident. And unless there's some sort of change in your internal being, in your internal person, there's not going to be any change at all. John Maxwell, who's an author of Thinker About Leadership, says every decision that you face offers a path of character or of compromise. And the more you choose character, the easier that choice becomes. The more you choose compromise, the easier that choice becomes. And I think that's probably what I should have said just to summarize all that stuff about neural pathways, but that gives you some more background. Anyway, finally, relationships are influenced and are often a result of what's going on inside. How you treat people that stress you out, how you treat people that suck up to you, that intimidate you, that you are jealous of, or that you want to be in a relationship with, or that you trust, or that you don't trust, that build up your ego, that influence you, that you choose to follow. I think so much of what we choose in our relationships comes from what's going on in our internal being. Who we surround ourselves with is often a reflection of who we are. There's that saying, bad company corrupts good character, but I think there was something maybe in the character that was drawn to that company. I don't think this is an argument, by the way, to avoid non-Christians. I think it's a kind of a generality. We just obviously need to be aware of how am I influencing my relationships and how are my relationships influencing me. So this all, in my understanding, is how the inner reality is expressed externally through behaviors, our reactions, our habits, our choices, our relationships. When we talk about character, we often use the word integrity, and there's some difference there. Integrity can be thought of in terms of the strength of the match between who someone says they are and who they actually are. So integrity is wholeness, it's completeness. When we talk about it in terms of character, it means that there's wholeness between the internal and the external, between all our various facets of our internal being, or between the inward congruent, so who we are inside is pretty consistent or congruent, and who we are outside is pretty consistent or congruent. So someone can trust us, we have credibility that we're going to be the same person no matter the situation, no matter who we're around, no matter what the stresses are that are coming towards us, we're going to be congruent as a person, or we're going to be the same person. And one model of that looks like this, and this might be a little overly complicated, but basically the 3 points of the triangle are the 3 main points of who we are as people. We all have our internal reality, our being. We all have an intellect, our knowing, and we all act on both, our doing. Like all models, this is an oversimplification and there's some weakness to it, but for our purposes, we can use this to help us think about 3 ways of expressing God's image in us. He is God whether or not he does anything, so his being. He's God because he's all-knowing and all-understanding, or knowing, and he acts out of who he is, his doing. Integrity in these 3 areas means that there's congruency between all of these facets of our lives and our personhood. So congruency means doing things that match up, and congruency is the key idea in this model. For example, when our doing flows out of our knowing, it means we're acting with competence. When we act contrary to what's true, we're being incompetent. Or when our doing is in line with who we are as moral people, or in line with our values, or our being, then there is credibility. So we act out of who we say we are. We've talked about this for a few weeks. Credibility is one of those things that people most look for in their leaders. Why? Because we know they will be consistent with who they say they are. So all of this to just kind of point to the fact that congruency, consistency, credibility all come out of who we are internally, and when we act consistent to that, to our values, then there's that's a good thing. That's strong character, that's strong integrity. So we think how we act, in one situation doesn't really affect us in other situations, but again, we're not these compartmentalized people. Yeah, we have these different aspects of our being, of our personhood, but we're not compartmentalized. So I can't go get drunk on Friday night and then on Sunday morning sit in church and pretend like nothing happened, It's not a matter of the drinking alcohol, it's the matter of the getting drunk and whatever I did when I was drunk and saying, well, that doesn't really matter. I can't be unfaithful to my wife and then, take her out to a really nice dinner and just pretend like nothing's wrong. There's what I do in one area of my life is going to affect the other areas. And when I try to live like it doesn't, there's a lot of inconsistency, a lot of incongruency. And when I'm not living out of the values that I have recognized in my life, there's just a lot of breakdown in my leadership and in who I am as a person, and a lot of integrity issues are going to start to show up. So what shapes our character? I talked about that a little bit before. There are a number of things probably, and there might be more than these 5, but I think these 5 are pretty fundamental character chisels, so to speak. So the first one I think is salvation. This is the ultimate change, the ultimate chisel and character shaper. It's a fundamental change within ourselves. It's the deepest part of our being. Our heart is changed completely. And again, I realize that I'm speaking from a totally Christian perspective, but I don't think there is any other change that can happen to a person that can fundamentally change as much as salvation, as much as accepting Christ. And I'll talk about that more. I don't think salvation is just some sort of singular event. I think it's an ongoing work of God. I think there's going to be evidence beyond just prayer or an altar call or a commitment. I think when we rely on just this experience, then I think, maybe we're missing something. I'm not going to get into the theology of all that, but I think it's important then to follow up the chisel of salvation with sanctification. And this is the process by which we become more like Christ. If we are believers, God's Spirit is constantly at work in us to make us more like Christ, to live more fully the image of God that we're created to image. And the Holy Spirit's been given to us really for that reason. And we're partners in this process because we can choose to respond or not. We can tune ourselves to God, or we can tune ourselves to the world or to our sin nature. So those things are all going to be decisions that we make, but are also shaping us as well. Relationships, parental influence, community, heroes. The most significant relationships in your life come from your family. Family relationships. Your parents have influenced you in more ways than you can possibly know or understand. And even if your parents are no longer alive, or if you no longer have relationship with a parent or both parents, that has shaped you. From birth, we either learn that we can trust others or that we can't trust others. And our parents are the ones that intentionally or unintentionally have taught us that. Sometimes I joke that my entire life is a reaction to my childhood, and in many ways that can be funny and humorous, but in other ways it's pretty serious. Yeah, I do a lot of things because of my initial family of origin, and some are good and some are bad. I think the community and our cultural context shapes us in innumerable invisible ways that we can't see until we get out of that context, and then we kind of look back at it and say, wow, this is part of who I am. We seek to the heroes in our lives, those people that we look up to, our role models, those that we seek to emulate. They create standards towards which we consciously or unconsciously strive. Someone recently asked me who my role model was, and I realized I don't know that there's one role model, but there's sort of this mosaic of characteristics that I've picked up from different people in my life that I really try to emulate in a lot of ways. And there's probably some unconscious ones there as well. I think our worldview, how we perceive, process, and understand the world around us, that's sort of our mental framework for understanding information. We all have a grid through which we filter incoming information. It's the way our brains work. We can't just take in some bit of information if we have no place to plug it in. That's why it's so helpful when people give examples or where they create analogies to sort of make connections with things that we do understand. We see this I think that's one reason why Jesus taught in parables, because he used things that people understood to try to explain things that were, maybe a little beyond understanding. We have to have some sort of pre-understanding in order to build greater awareness or understanding. And our pre-understandings are formed outside of our awareness from our family and our cultural contexts. And this worldview is usually unexamined because we don't know it's there, and we don't realize we have a grid which shapes our perception. So the way we perceive life, if you think that the world you live in is generally a good thing, or generally good, generally positive, generally healthy, then you're gonna see a situation completely different from someone who generally views the world as this negative, scary, fearful place to be. And then the final one, and I think, I don't know what to say, which one's stronger than the others. Obviously, I've already talked about how salvation and sanctification are strong, but adversity. Adversity, kind of simply defined, is a challenge to our preferred way of living. And that seems like such a tame definition of adversity. Feels like it should be termed like in a stronger way, like things that suck about my life. But in its simplest form, we all have a preferred way of living, and this is based on our worldview, so they're all kind of interconnected here. And when things challenge that preferred way of living, we're shaped either positively or negatively by them. They impact us. It could be simple adversity, like a broken down car that prevents us from getting to work. My preference is that I get to work on time, and this broken down car is a challenge to that. Or they might be really complex, as like when a parent dies when we're young. All of us would prefer to have happy, healthy, and whole families, and clearly death is an obstacle to that, or divorce is an obstacle to that preferred way of living. So that demonstrates that our preferred way of living could be a good thing, or could be a neutral thing, or could be a bad thing, but I think adversity challenges those things, and it shapes us. I think it shapes our worldview. I think it shapes our relationships. I think our relationships and our worldview shape how we respond to adversity. So again, all these things are sort of interconnected. But what does this all have to do with you as a leader? What do you do with this information? I think reflection leads to self-awareness. So I think it's important to reflect on each of these chisels and how they've shaped or influenced your character. How have you responded or not responded to these various chisels? How have you allowed them to shape you, or how have you resisted their shaping influence? The first and most important is salvation. I'm not sure the backgrounds of everybody in this class, but I would not begin to assume that all of you have committed your life to Christ. This commitment's personal, and it's deep, and it's not the shallow, feel-good religious exchange that's often presented as, say a prayer and you're granted a get-out-of-hell-free card. Committing your life to Christ is saying that you can't do life on your own, and that all of your attempts will end in complete failure, that ultimately nothing you can do or will do will please God apart from giving up on your own self-dependence. There's no such thing as being good enough or doing enough. God doesn't want any of that stuff. That makes it all about you and what you can do and how you can perform. Accepting the salvation that Christ offers means God allows you to see the reality of your situation without the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You can be a very religious person and even a very good person and completely miss the truth here. So I just think it's important to say. One way to think about sanctification, the next one, is to think about the initial process of becoming a believer and accepting Christ. In salvation, you acknowledge that you can't please God apart from Christ. It's trusting God rather than trying to please Him by being good and earning His love. Well, I think sanctification is the process of growing into this reality, of learning this, actually getting it. Often we think that once we get saved, well, now it's up to us to do the hard work of making ourselves acceptable to God. And God saved us, and now we owe Him big time. So we better get to work. And this work is often very good stuff. Bible reading, verse memorization, prayer, witnessing, acts of service, that sort of stuff. But none of these things make us more acceptable to God than we already are. And recently I've begun to think of sanctification as living in the reality of the grace that God offers, rather than living out of my best intentions and hoping they're good enough to make God happy with me. So it's important, I think, for you to think about this. What about you? Have you considered the ways in which you relate to God? Is it out of fear and an attempt to please God? Or is it out of fellowship with the Holy Spirit and resting in His grace? Are you tuned into God's work in your life, or are you distracted by everything the world has to offer, or what your sin nature still craves and seeks to control? So again, it's these essential areas of awareness, asking yourselves these questions about these chisels. You can see the rest of the chart here, but and the questions, but let me just highlight the final one of adversity. Pain can shape us in some tremendous ways. And if we ignore it and think we can stuff it down, it will shape us in some pretty unhealthy ways. I cannot express enough how important it is to be able to face the pain that has shaped you. Learning to admit the pain that has been part of our lives, I think, is a key step towards personal and emotional maturity. And I've seen leaders that refuse to face that stuff, and then it comes out in the way that they try to control and lead and manipulate, and it's messy. It would just be better for everyone, really, if they would just take some time and really examine what is going on in my life, and do I choose hard things or do I run from them? Well, anyway, there's more to say on all these topics, but again, I would encourage you to think about the questions that you see here. One book that has really influenced my thinking in all of these areas is a book called The Cure by Bruce McNichol, John Lynch, and Bill Thrall. Or if you just go on YouTube sometime and search for a sermon by John Lynch, and I say sermon, that's a bad example. It's more of a talk. It's a story he tells, and it's called Two Roads. So if you look up The Cure, John Lynch, Two Roads, or just Two Roads, John Lynch, in YouTube, and watch it. It's about 45 minutes long, but again, does not seem like a sermon, and I think it's a really good way of presenting these ideas. All right, I just want to tell a story to end things here. Several years ago, I was a residence hall director on the main campus of Grace College in Beta Hall. And for those students who are part of the Weber program and have never been to the main campus, Beta Hall is a big brick concrete bunker. It's pretty much just concrete and cinder block, and we joke that it could withstand a nuclear blast, and I'm pretty certain it actually could. So all that to say, when I was living there and sitting one day by myself in my apartment there, and it shook, I was a little surprised because I didn't think anything could actually shake that building. So I walked out the back door to kind of see what was going on. It was a really clear night. There was there weren't any clouds in the sky. There was no storm. It wasn't windy. And there was kind of nothing going on. It was in the summertime, so everything was pretty quiet. There weren't any students on campus. But I kind of looked down the hill into the wooded area, and there's just a lot of sort of trees down at the bottom of the hill were just sort of, it looked different. And some of them were kind of swaying back and forth. But there wasn't any wind, so I thought I should go down and investigate. So I went and I looked, and I walked down the hill, and there was a sort of giant tree that had fallen, and it broke about 20 or 30 feet up from the ground, and pretty horizontally. Like, it didn't break down the side. It just kind of split like someone just snapped a toothpick, and the top 2/3 of the tree had just fallen over and just taken out every tree around it. So I thought, well, that's very weird. There's no storms, probably wasn't any lightning. It didn't look like a lightning strike. What would make this giant tree just fall down? So I went to check it out, and I'm telling you, this thing's huge. I had to climb up on top of it. The stump was still big enough. I couldn't get my arms around it. That's how big it was. I walked down towards where it had broken off from the main part of the stump, and I kind of laid down on top of the trunk and leaned myself over, and I was just hit by this stench. It was just absolutely rotten inside the tree, and the tree had rotted from the inside out. Now, I looked at the tree, and it looked healthy. Green branches, green leaves. It looked like a healthy tree, but the inside was completely full of decay and rot and stench. And I realized as I looked around and I saw the damage that this tree had caused by taking out all of these other trees, maybe a dozen or so trees were directly damaged by the fall of this one big tree. I realized that's a great image of a leader without character. because a leader without character looks great on the inside, on the outside. Maybe he looks fruitful. Maybe she looks like she can get the job done. Maybe he looks like everybody. He's got that image. Whatever that is, and we all can probably think of examples. But on the inside, there's no character. There's no integrity. There's no strength. There's no inner strength. And so the whole thing is just waiting for some little, not even big disaster to happen. Remember, there's no storm, there's no wind. I don't know what made this tree fall down. It could have been a squirrel, jumping on it for all I know. But it couldn't take it. It couldn't take the stress anymore. It was too heavy for itself. It's the weight of responsibility of a leader will weigh on it so much that the leader itself just implodes and breaks. And the problem is, it's not just the leader that's damaged. It wasn't just the big tree that came down. That tree took out a dozen other little trees. So all of these other little trees growing up in its shadow were destroyed because that big one had rot in it. And I've seen that with leaders as well. All of the other little leaders that are growing up in its shadow, trying to be just like it, trying to be just like that person, or have that same image. When their leader falls, they're damaged. They're taken out. They're sort of sent to the sidelines, and it's a terrible thing to watch. And unfortunately, I've experienced it. A leader in my life had a great image, but was seriously lacking in character. And when that was uncovered, I was messed up for a little while. And I thought, all this leadership stuff that I'm talking about, it's all crap. It's meaningless. If you don't have any character, none of this stuff matters. And I think that's maybe an overstatement, but I think it's an important point. If you don't have any character, and if you're not willing to go beyond image, just expect that someday something's going to happen, and there's going to be a lot of pain that's caused to a lot of people. And I don't want that for you, and I don't want that for the people that follow you. So I would encourage you, reflect on your character, reflect on your ethics, take these questions seriously, and consider, who am I, and who am I becoming, and what am I going to do to move towards a more healthy, stronger character. Those are the things I want you to consider this week. If you have any questions, as always, I'd love to talk to you. Thanks.